Mika sat very still in her chair and tried not to move too much. The white classroom was so clean and bright that it hurt her eyes a little. But she had gotten used to it after 3 weeks of being here. Every morning she came to this same room and sat in the same chair and listened to Professor Vellum talk about peace and understanding between different alien species. The other students in the room looked nothing like her. They had thin arms and legs that seemed like they might break if someone touched them too hard. Their skin was pale and soft-looking, and some of them had big eyes that took up most of their faces. Mika counted 30 other students, and every single one of them was from a different planet. None of them were human like her. Professor Vellum stood at the front of the room with his 4 long arms moving as he talked. His blue skin was so thin that Mika could see the veins underneath it. He was tall and moved like he was floating instead of walking. The way he spoke was soft and gentle, and he never raised his voice even when students were not paying attention. Today he was teaching them about something called interspecies ethics, which was basically rules about how different aliens should treat each other. The main rule seemed to be that fighting was always wrong, and that smart beings should always talk about their problems instead of using violence. Professor Vellum said this at least 10 times during every class. Mika wore special metal bracelets on both her wrists that beeped quietly every few minutes. The bracelets were supposed to watch how fast she moved and how much strength she used when she touched things. The aliens who ran this space station had given them to her on her first day. They said it was for everyone's safety, including her own. She had been warned many times before coming here that she needed to be very careful. Earth was what they called a death world, which meant it was one of the most dangerous planets in the galaxy. The gravity was too strong. The animals were too mean and the weather was too harsh. Most aliens thought that anyone who could survive on Earth must be incredibly dangerous. The other students were afraid of her, even though she had never done anything scary. She could tell by the way they looked at her when they thought she was not watching. They whispered to each other in their strange alien languages and pointed at her. Sometimes she heard them say the word Deathworlder, and then they would get quiet and move away from her. Mika tried very hard to prove that humans were not monsters. She spoke quietly and moved slowly. She never raised her hand too fast or stood up too quickly. She let other students go through doorways first, and she never sat too close to anyone during lunch. She thought that if she was careful enough, they would see that she was just like them, but it was hard to be so careful all the time. On Earth, she had been a normal teenager who played sports and ran around, and laughed loudly with her friends. Here she had to think about every single movement and make sure she did not accidentally hurt someone with her terrible human strength. Professor Vellum was talking about a pretend situation where 2 alien groups wanted the same planet. He asked the class what they thought the groups should do to solve the problem. One student said they should have meetings for several years. Another student said they should ask a committee of other aliens to decide for them. A third student suggested they could split the planet in half and each group could have one side. Mika listened to all these ideas and thought about how humans had solved similar problems in Earth's history. Sometimes talking worked, but sometimes it did not. Sometimes one group was much stronger than the other and refused to listen to reasonable offers. Sometimes groups fought wars that lasted for years until one side won or both sides got tired of fighting. She raised her hand slowly and carefully. Professor Vellum nodded at her, and she could feel all the other students turning to look at her. She tried to ignore their staring eyes and asked her question in the softest voice she could manage. What happens when one group refuses to talk and just takes what they want anyway? What if talking does not work and they hurt innocent people while everyone is still trying to have meetings? The classroom became very quiet. Mika could hear the air recycling system humming and the quiet beeping of her metal bracelets. Professor Vellum looked confused, like she had asked him something in a language he did not understand. The other students looked uncomfortable. Some of them made faces like they had smelled something bad. A few students near her moved their chairs away from her desk. One student made a small, scared noise. Professor Vellum cleared his throat and said that civilized beings always found peaceful solutions if they tried hard enough. He said that violence was never necessary if people were educated and reasonable. He said that anyone who thought fighting might be needed was probably not civilized enough to be part of galactic society. Mika felt her jaw muscles get tight, but she did not say anything else. She nodded politely and wrote some notes in her notebook, even though she was not really listening anymore. She had heard this same answer many times before, and it always made her feel frustrated. The lesson continued with more pretend situations that all had the same kind of peaceful solutions. Mika listened to her classmates talk about forming committees and having long discussions and asking for help from neutral alien governments. They seemed to think that every problem could be solved if people just talked long enough and used the right polite words. She thought about Earth history lessons where talking had not been enough. She thought about times when good people had to fight to protect others from bad people who would not listen to reason. She thought about how sometimes the only way to stop someone from hurting innocent people was to make them stop by force. But she kept these thoughts to herself because she knew that saying them out loud would only make the other students more afraid of her. She was here to learn about other species and help them understand that humans were not evil. She was supposed to be building bridges between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. When class finally ended, Mika packed her things very slowly and let all the other students leave first. She had learned that if she tried to leave at the same time as everyone else, they would push and shove to get away from her faster. It was easier to just wait until the room was empty. As she walked through the long, white hallways of the space station, other students moved out of her way. Some of them pressed themselves against the walls and watched her pass with wide, frightened eyes. Others turned and walked in different directions when they saw her coming. A few brave ones stared at her and whispered to their friends about the dangerous human girl. Mika had gotten used to being alone, but it still made her sad sometimes. She had come here hoping to make friends and learn about different cultures. Instead, she spent most of her time by herself reading books and doing homework. She ate meals at empty tables and studied in quiet corners where no one else wanted to sit. She wondered if the exchange program had been a mistake. Maybe humans really were too different from other aliens. Maybe there was no way for them to live together peacefully. Maybe she should go back to Earth and tell everyone that it was impossible to be friends with species who thought humans were monsters. But then she remembered why she had volunteered for this program in the first place. Humans were planning to explore more of the galaxy and meet more alien species. If they could not learn to get along with the peaceful aliens at this school, how could they ever be trusted to visit other planets? So Mika kept trying even though it was hard. She kept being careful and quiet and polite. She kept hoping that someday one of her classmates would see past the scary stories about Deathworlders and realize that she was just a person who wanted to learn and make friends. She walked to her small dormitory room and sat down at her desk to do homework. The metal bracelets beeped softly as she picked up her pen, and she made sure to write very gently so she would not break the fragile alien paper. 3 weeks had passed since Mika first sat in Professor Vellum's classroom, and she had learned to live with the strange routine of being the only human on the space station. Every morning she woke up early and practiced moving slowly in her small room. She would pick up objects very carefully and walk around without making noise. The metal bracelets on her wrists had stopped beeping as much because she had gotten better at controlling her movements. The best part of her day was lunchtime, because that was when she got to sit with Hana, her only friend on the entire station. Hana was different from all the other alien students because she was not afraid of Mika at all. In fact, she seemed curious about humans and asked lots of questions about Earth and what it was like to live on such a dangerous planet. Hana belonged to a species called the Cathara, and she was even smaller than most of the other students. She was only about 4 feet tall with big round eyes that sparkled when she smiled. Her skin was a light purple color and she had tiny hands that moved quickly when she talked. She reminded Mika of a friendly bird or maybe a small fairy from the stories her grandmother used to tell her. During lunch, Hana would ask things like what kind of animals lived on Earth and why humans had to be so strong, and whether it was true that Earth had weather that could kill people. Mika tried to answer honestly, but she also tried not to scare Hana with stories about hurricanes and earthquakes and wild animals that hunted other animals for food. Today was another ethics class, and Professor Vellum was talking about territorial disputes again. He described a situation where one group of aliens needed more space because their population was growing too fast and they wanted to expand into areas where another group already lived. The professor asked the class what they thought should happen. One student suggested that both groups should form a joint committee that would meet once a week for several years to discuss the problem. Another student said they should ask the Galactic Council to send negotiators who could help them find a compromise. A third student recommended that they should take turns using the disputed territory, with each group getting to use it for 6 months at a time. Mika listened to all these suggestions and tried not to think about how humans had solved similar problems throughout history. Sometimes negotiations worked and sometimes they did not. Sometimes one group was much stronger and refused to listen to reason. Sometimes wars happened and people died before anyone could find a peaceful solution. She thought about how humans had learned to build upward instead of outward when they ran out of space. They had invented new farming techniques that could feed more people using less land. They had even started exploring space to find new planets instead of fighting over the ones they already had. But she knew that these solutions had not come easily, and sometimes conflict had been necessary to protect people who could not protect themselves. After class ended, Mika walked with Hana toward the dormitory section of the station. They took their usual route through the quieter hallways where there were fewer students and less chance of accidentally bumping into someone. Mika had learned that even a gentle touch from her could bruise the delicate aliens, so she tried to stay away from crowded areas as they walked through a section that was not monitored as closely by the station's security systems. They came across a group of older students who were gathered near one of the observation windows. These students were from a species called the Zinthari, and they were among the largest aliens on the station. The Zinthari stood about 7 feet tall and had thick, gray skin that looked like armor. They were stronger than most other alien species, but still much weaker than humans. Their leader was a student named Kale who had been on the station for 2 years and thought he was very important because of his size and age. Kale had noticed Mika during her first week, and he did not like the attention she received as the only Deathworlder student. He was used to being the biggest and strongest student in any group, and having a human around made him feel less special. The other aliens still feared him, but they whispered more about the dangerous human girl than they did about him. When Kyle saw Mika and Hana walking together, he stepped into their path and blocked the hallway. His 4 friends spread out behind him so that the 2 girls could not easily walk around them. Mika felt her heart start beating faster, but she kept her face calm and tried to think of what Professor Vellum would say about this situation. Kale started talking in a loud voice about how humans did not belong in civilized society. He said that Deathworlders were too violent and primitive to learn alongside peaceful species. He claimed that having Mika in their classes was dangerous, and that she should be sent back to her savage planet before she hurt someone. Mika tried to use the diplomatic techniques she had learned in ethics class. She spoke in a quiet, calm voice, and suggested that they could discuss any concerns through proper channels. She said that she understood their worries, but that she was here to learn, and had no intention of causing trouble. She asked if they could please step aside so she and Hana could continue to their dormitory, but Kale was not interested in peaceful discussion. He had decided that he wanted to prove he was not afraid of the human girl, and that he was still the strongest student on the station. His friends encouraged him by making aggressive gestures and blocking the hallway even more completely. Hana tried to help by explaining that Mika had been nothing but kind and gentle during their friendship. She said that humans were not monsters and that everyone should give Mika a chance to prove herself. But this only made Kale angrier because he felt like the small Kithara was choosing the human over her own kind. The situation was getting worse instead of better, and Mika could see that her diplomatic training was not working. Kale and his friends were not interested in reasonable discussion or compromise. They wanted to intimidate her and show the other students that they were not afraid of the dangerous Deathworlder. Mika kept trying to find a peaceful solution, because that was what she had been taught to do in Professor Vellum's class. She suggested that they could report their concerns to the station administrators. She offered to answer any questions they had about human culture. She even apologized if she had done anything to offend them without knowing it, but Kale had made up his mind that talking was finished. He looked at his friends and saw that they were all watching to see what he would do. He felt like he had to prove his strength and dominance, or else he would lose respect among the other students. Without warning, Kale reached out and shoved Hana hard with both hands. The small Cathara was not expecting the attack and could not defend herself. She flew backward and crashed into the metal wall of the hallway with a sickening thud. Her tiny body crumpled to the floor and she cried out in pain as her arm bent at an angle that was clearly wrong. Mika heard her friend scream and saw Hana lying on the floor holding her broken arm. Everything around her seemed to slow down and get very quiet. The diplomatic training disappeared from her mind like it had never existed. Something cold and dangerous settled over her thoughts as millions of years of human evolution kicked, and the other students suddenly realized that they might have made a terrible mistake, but it was already much too late to take back what they had done. Mika did not move from where she stood, but everything about her changed in a way that made the air in the hallway feel heavy and dangerous. Her breathing became slow and steady like someone who was getting ready to do something that required perfect control. Her eyes, which had always been soft and kind when she looked at her classmates, now focused on Kyle, with the intensity of a hunter who had found exactly what it was looking for. The metal bracelets on her wrists started beeping frantically as they detected changes in her body that their alien makers had programmed them to watch for. Her heart rate had not increased the way most species would when they got angry. Instead, it had slowed down and become more regular. Her muscles were not tense with uncontrolled emotion, but rather coiled like springs that were being compressed by an expert who knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Kale realized too late that something fundamental had shifted in the human girl who had been so careful and polite for the past 3 weeks. He started to say something that might have been an apology or maybe an explanation, but Mika was not interested in hearing words anymore. She had spent weeks trying to communicate through language and diplomacy and peaceful discussion, but watching her only friend get hurt had awakened something that existed far deeper than cultural training. All the lessons about interspecies ethics and conflict resolution disappeared from her mind like they had never existed in their place. Rose instincts that had been shaped by millions of years of evolution on a planet where everything from the weather to the smallest insects tried to kill anything that showed weakness. Her ancestors had survived ice ages and predators and natural disasters not by talking about their feelings, but by protecting those who could not protect themselves. Hana was still crying softly on the floor and trying to hold her broken arm in a position that did not hurt as much. The sound of her friend's pain cut through every piece of diplomatic training that Mika had received before coming to the space station. All the warnings about being careful with her strength and moving slowly and never showing aggression became completely irrelevant in the face of someone who had chosen to hurt an innocent person. Still sitting in the same relaxed position, Mika reached out toward Kyle with movements that looked almost casual and lazy. Her arm extended across the distance between them faster than any of the aliens could process because their eyes had evolved on peaceful worlds where nothing moved with the speed of a creature that had learned to catch prey or avoid becoming prey themselves. Her hand closed around Kale's thick armored forearm. With what appeared to be the gentlest possible touch, she was not grabbing or clutching or holding tightly. Instead, her fingers simply settled into place around his arm like they belonged there. The Zenthari student tried to pull away because he suddenly felt very uncomfortable, but he discovered that he could not move his arm at all. Mika began to speak in the same quiet voice she had always used in Professor Velim's classroom. Her tone was calm and reasonable, and she did not sound angry or emotional. She simply explained that Kyle had hurt her friend, and that this was not something she could allow to happen. Her words were polite and measured, but there was something underneath them that made all the why. Watching students feel like they were hearing a predator explain why it was about to do something terrible. As she talked, Mika gradually began to increase the pressure of her grip around Kale's arm. The change was so slow and steady that at first, he thought he was imagining it, but after a few seconds he realized that the gentle touch was becoming uncomfortable, and after a few more seconds it was becoming painful. Kale's armored skin had evolved over thousands of years to protect his species from the strongest weapons and natural dangers on their homeworld. It could deflect energy blasts and resist impacts that would shatter most materials, but it had never been designed to withstand the steady, crushing force of muscles that had been built by gravity 3 times stronger than what the Zenthari had ever experienced. The other Zenthari students watched in growing horror as their leader, who had always been the strongest person they knew, began to make small sounds of distress. Was trying to pull free, but the human girl's grip was like being caught in some kind of mechanical device that could not be reasoned with or intimidated, or convinced to let go. They finally began to understand why every species in the galaxy treated humans with such extreme caution. This quiet girl, who had been so careful not to bump into anyone in the hallways, was demonstrating strength that made no sense according to everything they thought they knew about biology. She had not even stood up from her relaxed position, and she was completely overpowering someone who outweighed her by more than 100 pounds. Mika continued talking in her calm, educational voice as if she were answering a question in ethics class. She explained that, on Earth, when someone chose to hurt innocent people, there were consequences for their actions. She said that talking and negotiation were wonderful tools, but they only worked when all parties were acting in good faith. When someone decided to use violence against the defenseless, then violence was the only language they would understand. Kale was now making whimpering sounds and trying desperately to signal his friends to help him, but none of them knew what to do. They had never seen anyone overpower him before, and they were afraid that if they tried to help, the human might decide to grab them too. The stories they had heard about Deathworlders suddenly seemed much more real and terrifying. The pressure around Kale's arm continued to increase with the same steady inevitability of a machine that had been programmed to complete a specific task. His thick gray skin began to show stress fractures as the force exceeded what his natural armor could withstand. He could feel his bones starting to bend under the relentless squeeze of human fingers that had been designed by evolution to grip tools and weapons and climbing surfaces on a world where letting go meant death. Mika looked directly into Kale's eyes as she delivered what sounded like a lesson from Professor Vellum's class. She explained that humans preferred peace, but they were also prepared for war. She said that they did not seek conflict, but they would never hesitate to protect those who could not protect themselves. She told him that this was not cruelty or savagery, but rather the most basic responsibility that intelligent beings had toward each other. The sound of Kale's arm breaking was surprisingly quiet, just a soft crack that echoed in the hallway, like a branch snapping under too much weight. The moment Kale's arm broke with that quiet cracking sound, Mika released him immediately and stood up in one smooth motion that showed no sign of the effort she had just used. Her movements were graceful and controlled as she stepped over the groaning Zenthari student and knelt down beside Hana, who was still sitting against the wall holding her injured arm. Kale collapsed to the floor, clutching his shattered limb and staring up at Mika with eyes that were wide with terror and disbelief. He had never imagined that anyone could be so strong, especially someone who looked so small and harmless. His friends had backed away until they were pressed against the far wall of the hallway, finally understanding why every species in the galaxy whispered fearful stories about humans and their death world. Mika gently examined Hana's arm and spoke to her friend in the same soft voice she had always used. The contrast was shocking to the watching aliens who had just seen her calmly break Kale's bones, while explaining human philosophy about protecting innocent people. Now she was being as gentle as a parent caring for a hurt child, and her touch was so light that Hana barely felt it. Security officers arrived within 3 minutes because the space station's automated systems had detected the sounds of the fight and the stress signals from Mika's monitoring bracelets. The security team was made up of different alien species, and they approached the scene very carefully with their weapons drawn, but not aimed at anyone specific. They had all heard stories about what humans could do when they were angry, but seeing the aftermath with their own eyes was completely different. One large Zenthari student was lying on the floor with an obviously broken arm, while a small Kythera sat against the wall with her own injury. And in the middle of it all was one completely calm human girl who showed no signs of having worked hard or gotten tired. The security chief was a tall alien with green skin and 4 arms who had been trained to handle all kinds of dangerous situations, but he had never dealt with a human before, and everything he had learned about Deathworlders made him very nervous. He kept his distance and asked Mika to explain what had happened. Mika answered all his questions in a polite and straightforward way that made her sound like she was giving a report in one of her classes. She described exactly what had occurred without showing any emotion or trying to make excuses. She said that Kale had attacked Hana, so she had stopped him using the minimum force necessary. She had then immediately provided aid to both injured parties. The security chief found her calm manner more disturbing than if she had been yelling or crying or showing signs of the adrenaline rush that most species experienced after violence. Her heart rate and breathing were completely normal, and she seemed as relaxed as if she had just finished a pleasant conversation. The monitoring bracelets on her wrists had stopped beeping and were showing readings that indicated she was not stressed at all. Medical teams arrived to treat both injured students, and Mika stepped back to give them room to work. She watched carefully as they examined Hana's arm and asked questions about where it hurt and whether she could move her fingers. The medics confirmed that the Kithara had a clean break that would heal properly with treatment. When they turned to examine Kale, the medics were more concerned, because his injury was more severe. The steady pressure that Mika had applied had not just broken his arm, but had compressed it in a way that would require surgery to repair. His thick, armored skin had multiple fractures, and some of his internal structures had been damaged. Professor Velim arrived at the scene 20 minutes later after being summoned by security. He had expected to find evidence of savage violence based on the reports he had received. Instead, he found medical teams treating injuries while Mika sat quietly nearby answering questions from investigators. She looked exactly the same as she did during his ethics classes. The professor struggled to understand how his lesson about peaceful conflict resolution had somehow led to this situation. He had taught his students that violence was never necessary if people were civilized and reasonable. He had believed that education and cultural sensitivity could prevent any conflict between different species. He approached Mika and asked her directly why she had not followed the diplomatic protocols they had discussed in class. Why had she not attempted to resolve the situation through discussion and compromise? Why had she chosen to use physical force instead of seeking help from proper authorities? Mika looked at Professor Velim with the patient expression of someone who was explaining something very obvious to a child who did not understand basic facts about the world. She pointed out that she had tried diplomacy first and had attempted to de-escalate the situation using exactly the techniques he had taught. She had spoken calmly and politely. She had suggested proper channels for addressing concerns. She had offered to answer questions and even apologized for any unintended offense. But Kale had chosen to ignore all of these attempts at peaceful resolution and had instead decided to attack an innocent person who could not defend herself. When someone makes that choice, Mika explained, then talking becomes useless because they have already demonstrated that they do not respect reasonable discussion. The only language they understand at that point is force applied with precision and purpose. She had used exactly enough strength to stop the threat and no more. Professor Velim tried to argue that there must have been other options that she had not considered. Perhaps she could have called for help, or tried to physically block the attack, or found some way to protect Hana without hurting Kale. But Mika shook her head and explained that all of those alternatives would have taken too long or been ineffective. By the time security arrived, Hana could have been hurt much worse. The aliens on this station were too fragile to physically intervene against someone as large as Kale, and running away would have meant abandoning her friend to someone who had already shown willingness to cause harm. As they spoke, more students gathered at what they thought was a safe distance to stare at the human who had just completely changed their understanding of what the word dangerous meant. They whispered to each other about what they had witnessed and tried to make sense of how someone so small could overpower someone so much larger. Some of them were afraid and wanted Mika to be removed from the station immediately. Others were fascinated and wanted to understand how human strength worked. A few seemed to be thinking about the philosophical questions her actions had raised about when violence might be necessary. Mika noticed their stares and felt the familiar sadness that had become part of her daily experience on the space station. She had hoped that this exchange program would help build bridges between humans and other species. But instead of proving that humans could be peaceful, she had probably confirmed every frightening story they had ever heard about Deathworlders. She wondered if it was possible for species with such different backgrounds to ever truly understand each other. The disciplinary hearing took place 5 days later in the largest meeting room on the space station. Representatives from 12 different alien species sat around a curved table that looked like it was made from some kind of crystal or polished stone. The room was designed to make everyone feel calm and peaceful with soft lighting and gentle music playing in the background. Mika sat in a chair that seemed too small for the seriousness of what was happening. She wore her usual simple clothes and the metal monitoring bracelets that had become such a normal part of her daily routine. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she looked as relaxed as if she were waiting for another ethics class to begin. The hearing had been going on for 3 hours, and many different people had spoken about what they thought should happen to the human student. Some wanted her removed from the station immediately because they believed she was too dangerous to be around civilized beings. Others suggested that she needed intensive counseling to learn how to control her violent impulses. Kyle testified first with his arm still in a special healing device that looked like it was made of light and energy. He admitted that he had started the confrontation and that he had pushed Hana first, but he claimed that he had never expected such a severe response to what he considered just a minor physical interaction. He said that where he came from, pushing someone was just a way of showing dominance and that the other person would usually back down or push back in a similar way. Nobody ever got seriously hurt because everyone understood the rules of these kinds of social conflicts. Professor Vellum spoke next and described Mika's behavior in his classes. He said that she had always been quiet and respectful, but that she asked disturbing questions about the limits of peaceful solutions. He recommended that she be sent back to Earth because humans clearly could not control their aggressive instincts enough to participate in galactic academic programs. Several other instructors agreed with Professor Vellum and provided examples of how human history was filled with wars and violence. They argued that Deathworlders might never be able to adapt to civilized society because their evolution had made them too focused on fighting and survival. But then Hana was called to speak, and everything in the room changed. The small Cathara female walked slowly to the front with her arm now healed thanks to advanced alien medical technology. She looked directly at the panel of judges and began to tell her side of the story. Hana described the weeks of friendship she had shared with Mika and how careful and gentle the human had been. In all their interactions, she explained that Mika had never once moved too quickly or used too much strength even when she was excited or happy about something. She told the panel about how Mika had tried to avoid the confrontation with Kale by suggesting they discuss their concerns through proper channels. She emphasized that the human had only acted after Hana herself was injured, and that Mika had immediately provided help once the threat was stopped. Most importantly, Hana explained that Mika had used exactly the right amount of force to stop Kale from hurting anyone else. She had not continued the attack after he was no longer dangerous. She had not acted out of anger or revenge, but rather out of a desire to protect someone who could not protect herself. The human representative stood up next to address the panel. She was an older woman who worked for the diplomatic corps and had been involved in arranging student exchanges between Earth and other worlds. She had traveled to many different planets and worked with dozens of alien species. She explained that what the panel had witnessed was not savage violence, but rather the calculated response of someone who had been trained from childhood to protect others. She said that on Earth the ability to respond decisively to threats was considered a virtue, not a character flaw. Humans did not seek out violence, she continued, but they also did not hesitate to use it when gentler methods failed to protect innocent people. This was not a bug in human programming that needed to be fixed, but rather a feature that made humans valuable allies to those who shared their commitment to protecting the weak. She reminded the panel that human soldiers and peacekeepers were serving throughout the galaxy, helping to protect colonies and trade routes from pirates and hostile forces. The same instincts that made humans effective protectors were what they had seen in Mika's response to the attack on her friend. Finally, Mika was allowed to speak for herself. She stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room where she faced the panel of alien judges. Her voice was calm and clear as she began to explain what she had learned during her time on the station. She said that she had come here to study different species and their approaches to solving problems. She had learned much about diplomacy and peaceful negotiation, and she valued these tools highly. They were elegant solutions that could resolve conflicts without anyone getting hurt. But she had also learned that some individuals chose not to participate in civilized discourse. When someone decided to hurt innocent people while others were still trying to negotiate, then talking became a luxury that victims could not afford on Earth. She explained humans had a saying that captured their philosophy perfectly. They hoped for peace, but prepared for war. This did not mean they wanted to fight, but rather that they would always be ready to fight when fighting became necessary to protect those who could not protect themselves. She looked directly at Professor Valim as she continued. Humans understood that civilization was not maintained by the civilized, but rather by those who were willing to do uncivilized things to uncivilized people. Peace existed because good people were prepared to use violence against those who would destroy peace. This was not a character flaw that needed to be corrected, but rather the foundation that made all other virtues possible. Without guardians who were willing to act when words failed, there could be no safe spaces for diplomacy and learning and cultural exchange. The panel deliberated for 2 hours before announcing their decision. Mika would be allowed to continue her studies, but with additional monitoring and cultural sensitivity training. More importantly, the curriculum would be expanded to include courses on human ethics and the concept of protective violence. As Mika left the hearing room with Hana walking beside her, she realized that the exchange program might actually succeed after all. The other students in the hallways still gave her space, but their expressions had changed from simple fear to something more complex that included respect. They had learned that the quiet Deathworlder girl was not a monster waiting to explode into random violence, but rather a guardian who would sit peacefully until someone threatened those under her protection. And in a galaxy full of peaceful species, having a few guardians around was not such a terrible thing.